Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had. He set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything he had, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'll set out, I'll go back to my father, and I'll say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." Now again, I said that this story is probably familiar to many of us. And even if we've maybe never been an avid Bible reader, it's sort of one of those stories that has kind of like stepped out of the Bible and sort of stepped into the collective memory of our culture. And I think that's because of this. I think that as we read that story, just like a lot of Jesus' stories, when you get to the essence of what is going on in the story, it's a story that we can all relate to, right? The primary character that we think of from this story is the one that we sort of name it after. We call it the prodigal son. And the prodigal son is this young man. As I read the story, you saw this. He has everything he needs here, right? He's got everything he could ever want. He's got the house. He's got the family. Apparently his dad is wealthy because he's got servants who work for him. I mean, everything. It's this. He's just set for life. But he finds himself wanting something else. He looks around. He's sitting in this place, and he looks around and he goes, "Yeah, this is great. I've got everything I've ever wanted, but I know this. I know this stuff. I know these things, but I want something more." And this sort of something more seems to promise escape from his boring, mundane life. So what's he want? He wants control of his choices, right? We see that there. He wants the satisfaction for his own desires. We get that from that cool phrase. He goes into wild living, right? Goes into wild living. So he wants his own desires sort of like fulfilled. But ultimately, did you see what happens to him as he does this? He gives up everything he has, all this good stuff that he's got going on. He says, I want to go off. I want to be on my own. I want to do my own thing. I want my own choices. I want all of my desires to be met the way that I want them to be met. But then in the end of it, it leaves him feeling lost, right? It leaves him feeling out of control. And it leaves him physically and spiritually completely empty. And I think all of us, and whether we're followers of Jesus, church people, whatever, we can all relate to this. Because all of us have, at one point or another, wanted something more out of life. We start to feel confined. We start to feel trapped in our own lives. We start to think that the grass is greener on the other side of where we are. We think, oh, if I could just get out of this life and I could just go live that life, like that would fulfill everything that I ever wanted. So I'll just go to that place. And like the younger son, we start to fall into all kinds of traps. We start to fall into this, and in the end of the day, we don't find that the grass is actually greener. It's more burnt, it's grosser, we lost something on the way, we're out of control, and we end up empty. But here's the good news. What we see today in this story is like the prodigal son, we don't have to live in the regret of bad choices. We don't have to live in regret of bad choices because we can experience grace, mercy, and love on the road that leads back home. So now let's go slowly through the story and see how it pulls us through it and shows us what we can look like. So Luke 15, starting in verse 11. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Now, as I started to think about the biblical idea of inheritance and the father giving his share of the estate to his son, it's one of those things that I think we have to sort of have a modern day equivalent for us to begin to think about this. And the first thing that came to my mind as I began to think about what does this look like? How does this divided inheritance look like? I began to think of the Instagram reels that I have seen of the baby boomers that are all in a room, and I'm pretty sure they're somewhere like in the Villages in Florida or something. And they're in like this ballroom, and they're all dancing, and there's like this one old, stocky kind of old guy, and he's just like grooving. I mean, he is getting down with the music, and everybody's super happy. And then there's a caption underneath it in the reel that says something like this: "The boomers celebrating their $1 million properties they bought for a pack of gum." Now, all of us probably feel like that in some way or another. That we look and we're like, how did you got that? So I don't understand. But we understand the inheritance here. Now here's what I want to make sure to say is clear about this. That idea might be true. The grandfather in that video probably did buy his house for a pack of gum in the 50s or the 60s. But I would hope that none of his descendants are wishing for his quick demise so that they can get a hold of the property. That is the brutal undertone of this story. And imagine the father hearing those words. The father looks at his son, and his son is literally saying, "Dad, I wish you had died sooner so I could get my inheritance, but since you seem to want to keep going, I'll just take it now, and I'll be on my way." And by on his way, he means he's gone. He is dead to him. If his father won't die, he will, and he'll go live his own life. Yet here's the weird part of the story. He honors his son's request. And we don't know what was going back in the conversation, because again, this is a story. These aren't real people. This is a story that Jesus told. But you would think there would be some inner dialogue happening between the father and the son. And I want you to know, son, that you've hurt me deeply. And you think there'd be some appropriate, critical, crucial conversation taking place. But the father just honors the son's request. Listen to what he says. Not long after that, the son got together all that he had, right? So we see in verse 12, he divided his property between them, so he just split it up. The son took what had been split up, he took all of it that he had, he set off for a distant country, and then we get this great phrase, he squandered his wealth in wild living. Now, like we talked about earlier, here is this son. He's walking away from home. He walks away from safety, provision. He walks away from the warmth of his father's house. And he believes that down that road to this other land is going to be a better place to live. It's going to be better on the other side of wherever he's going to. But it doesn't take long, and then the whole plan falls apart, right? He spends everything, and then the story tells us, then it even goes bad to worse. After he had spent everything, so all the money's already gone. It says, then there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. And I start to think about this character. Like, I imagine this guy, he's out of money, then there's a famine that comes. You have to imagine he's sort of like, what is going on? I don't deserve to be in this situation. You know who my father is. Oh, Daddy. I can't go back to him. I just spent all his money. And it just hits like a ton of bricks. It goes on, it says, so he went. He hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his field to feed pigs. And then listen to this important verse. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And I think that's such an odd sort of break there, because it's almost like he's saying, like, he gets hired to go do this work, and he looks at the food that they're supposed to be feeding the pigs, and it's almost like he didn't even get to the work yet. He didn't even get there because he was maybe so hungry, he was so tired, he was so worn out. He's just like, can I just have some of the food first, and then I'll get to work? You know, and then one of the other workers who is experiencing this famine as well, and maybe he's got a family down the street, and nobody's doing well, and he looks at the guy and he's just like, no, we're here to work. Would you just, come on, can you just do this? Can we just, no, we don't have time. We're just going to go eat. And it's like, it's just crushing on this guy. And where he lands is, and crushing is probably a good word here, is the prodigal son hits this place that we would call the rock bottom. Now, rock bottom is a cool term. It's an old mining term for when miners would get to the lowest layer of rock, and they literally couldn't get any lower. So they're in this mine shaft, and they're digging, and they hit this rock, and can you imagine somebody calling out, we've hit the rock bottom. In a lot of ways, the metaphor makes sense. Because think about it this way. They've mined out everything good they can get out of the mine. Now there's nothing left but an empty, dark cavern. They hit rock bottom. See, it's one of those phrases that we use in culture, like that we talk about. We're like, oh, I've hit rock bottom. Like, have you really hit rock bottom? Like, have you mined all the good out of this, and you are literally in the dark cavern, and it is empty? There is nothing left. And his response here is actually pretty incredible when he gets to rock bottom, where the prodigal son found himself in this darkest moment. He realized the life that he thought that he had wanted. What he thought he wanted, what he thought he should have, actually led to emptiness and complete despair. And this is where the story shifts. And this is where we learn something about grace, love, and compassion. It says when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out, I'll go back to my father, and I'll say to him, I love this because he's rehearsing. Does anybody ever rehearse when they've got like a meeting coming up? They've got a conversation that they're worried about. That's a good thing to do, isn't it? Right, Amy? Like, that's a good thing to do. You should, it's really healthy to rehearse those things. It actually is helpful to think about those conversations. Sometimes you could rehearse, maybe this is the worst this is going to go, and I'm just going to rehearse that reality. And then if it turns out a different way, hey, everything's okay. Sometimes it just helps you to navigate the words that you're going to say. Maybe it just helps you get to the emotions before the emotions get to you. But I love this because that's what he does for us here, and it's really a healthy thing. The prodigal son looks at his situation. He says, I am in the darkest place that I could ever be. I have mined my life of all that it has. I'm in this dark, deep cavern. What am I going to do? And you wonder, is anybody else around? He's just like, what am I going to do? All the other guys are like, would you start working? We have pigs to feed. We've got families to feed. I don't care about your existential crisis that you're having about you and your relationship with your father who you screwed over so you could come and make it rain in my land. Go back to your home. He says, I'll do that. I will go back to my home. And then he begins to think about what he's going to say to him. I have sinned against heaven and earth. And he probably says to himself, man, that sounds good. This might actually work. And then he goes on and he continues on. He says, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He's like, I hope somebody's filming this because I might even get an Oscar. Then this is his kicker, because there's three parts to this, right? There's always three parts. The kicker is this: make me like one of your hired servants. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. He's been rehearsing this. We have no idea how long he's been rehearsing it, but he is ready. Now, I'm not trying to say that somehow he's not sincere here. I think he is sincere. But I think he is so rehearsed in this because I think he thinks, my father, there's no way. When he's saying, make me like a hired servant, he's not like, oh, I expect him to show me love and compassion. So, I'll take the hit here. I will. Just make me like a hired servant. That's good enough for me. Like, I think that's where he's at. I think it's like really far. I think he's not even going to let me come in. He's going to tell, go down to a different land. You're not even welcome here. You just keep walking by. Instead, he's like, maybe if I say this, maybe if I really repent and I come to him and I say, okay, I just want to be on your property. I just want to know I can be at home. He's willing to slave away in the fields and stare at the home he grew up in. This is where he's at. So he goes on, so he got up, he went to his father, but he was still a long way off, and listen to this. His father saw him, filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. He threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. Now, if we go back in the story when the son was at his lowest, do you remember what we said? Nobody would show him compassion. He needed something to eat, and everybody just said, no. But look what his father was doing while his son had been away. So while everybody else is not showing him compassion and telling him he's got to deal with what he's done, he did this to himself. It's his own situation. Why would you even go home? There's no way your father is going to welcome you back home. But the whole time that he had been dealing with that, his father was watching, waiting, and hoping for his son's return. His father was at the end of the road, staring down towards that land, waiting just to see his son. And here's what's so beautiful about this story. When he saw him, he didn't stand there. He didn't just stand in place. He didn't wait for his son to come groveling back to him. He didn't put out his hand and say, kiss the finger, kiss the ring on the finger. He didn't wait for any of the groveling that you expected. Instead, he ran to him. He met him with open arms and a heart full of grace and mercy and love. And here's the amazing thing about the story. The father's love wasn't based on the son's actions. So the son rehearsed, thinking that if I do the right things, if I say the right things, if I just be the right kind of person, then I will get the love that my father will give me. Instead, no, the father's love isn't based on the son's actions at all. It is based completely on that father's heart. He embraced his son not because his son was worthy, but one simple fact, because he was his child. Still, the son couldn't believe it. None of us would we? The son couldn't believe what was happening. So I love this. He groveled anyways. He saw the love, he saw the compassion, he saw the grace, he saw the mercy of God. He saw his father running to him. He hugs him, he kisses him. And the son, still in that moment, because he had rehearsed his unworthiness. He had practiced being the unworthy son so much that he still can't help but go into his speech because he had prepared his mind for it. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And it starts to change a little bit now. Because now maybe he's recognizing the father's grace and compassion. Now he's realizing what he has done. Now his language begins to change. He's like, Father, why are you hugging me? I don't deserve this. What are you doing? I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against earth. I've sinned against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. You shouldn't even kiss me. You should just hand, like, I don't know what you're doing. And this is the most amazing part of the story. This is probably my favorite part of this story because of what happens right here. The father does what a father probably shouldn't do, which is completely ignores his son. But it's the exact right thing to do in this moment. He completely ignores his confession as if he didn't even hear the words of unworthiness. It's like the father didn't even hear the words of regret. Instead, his focus was completely on the restoration of his son. This is what he does. But the father said to his servants. So I love this moment. I want you to picture this moment with me. I want you to imagine the son being hugged by the father. The father hugging the son, and the son, he's deep down in his chest. He's like, Dad, I don't deserve this. Stop. I'm not worthy to be called your son. And he's like, shut up. Hey, get him a robe. Shh. Get him a coat. But Dad, nothing. Stop talking. I love you, and I want to restore you. Listen, it's so amazing. But the father said to his servants, quick. Don't take time. Just get over here. Bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Talk about next week what all those things mean. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Now, a couple important points, I think, as we close up. The father didn't waste a single second with condemnation. Did you notice that? There was not a single second of condemnation. Not yet. There wasn't a single second of condemnation. So here's what I want us to see. This isn't just forgiveness, okay? Because I think for a lot of us, we think of this story just as a forgiveness story. But there's so much more going on here than just the forgiveness aspect. The father isn't interested in reminding him of his mistakes. He's got mistakes. He's got things he did. But the father is interested in restoring his identity as his beloved son. That's the goal. Now, this story can be looked at a bunch of different ways. It can be looked at as an illustration of God's universal salvation. It can be looked at as a teaching aimed at judgmental people because it kind of corrects our judgmental thoughts. It can also be a warning or a response to the arguments that happened in the early church about who was in and who was out and who should belong and who shouldn't. And all of those are valid points that we could explore. But I want to know, what does the story mean to you? See, there's not a single person in this room, there's not a single person watching this or listening to this who is perfect. And that is such good news. Because of what we learned from this story today. Because what the story teaches us, what Jesus is telling us, is that no matter how far you've walked away, no matter what you've done, that God is ready and waiting to run to you. Let's go further with that and see what else good news we find here. The other good news is you don't have to clean yourself up. You don't have to make yourself worthy. You don't have to prove anything. And that's what this awesome word grace is all about. Grace is love that reaches down without condemnation and says to you, welcome home. But while grace is amazing, this story isn't only about you and me. It's not just about our response to this kind of grace that we're seeing here. It's also about the kind of community that we're supposed to be as a result of this kind of grace. As a community following Jesus, we're called to be a reflection of this story, to live out the heart of the Father who loves unconditionally, forgives completely, and restores fully. I want us to imagine sitting in the first century church. And I want you to imagine the conversations that they were having. I want you to imagine the way that they were approaching people and the way they were looking at people. People from all different kinds of backgrounds coming to have a relationship with Jesus, and everybody wanted to get in everybody else's business about their relationship with Jesus rather than seeing that their relationship with Jesus is their relationship with Jesus. and that God has an incredible power to work in and through each and every one of us, and he doesn't need your nose sticking in somebody else's business unless they invite you to have it there. That make sense? Because no matter what you think about somebody else or what you think about who they are or where they've done or what other lands they might have gone to, you can't stand in the way of anybody else's relationship with their Heavenly Father. We're going to learn more about that in the final week, so I don't want to get too far into that this morning, but I just felt like maybe that just needs to be said. Our mission, our calling, our responsibility, as a result of this grace, is to be a place where prodigals can return. That's it. That's our calling. That's our mission. That's our vision. We want to be a place where prodigals can return. And we want those prodigals to know that they're welcome, loved, and forgiven. And imagine if every person in our entire community, imagine if anybody in our city, imagine if anybody in the donut counties, imagine if every person in those donut counties knew that they could find that kind of love, mercy, and grace. See, because the sign at the end of the road that the Father had sitting there like some kind of yard sign just said, "Welcome home, son." And it didn't have an asterisk. It didn't have a footnote. There was no bait and switch. It was just, "Welcome